Mark Nyman. I'm going to spend a few minutes going over a slide deck that covers some of the principles that we've learned over a number of years in doing HR design and HR transformation work. The first principle that is really key, and in some ways it's a mantra for us at RBL, but the principle is that in all the work that we do, what we have to do is keep what we call an outside-in perspective. One of the mistakes that we see, in fact, I would add probably the most common mistake at a high level that I see in HR design and HR transformation work, is that people do HR design in a way that they're trying to optimize the HR function. Our view is that the purpose and the intent of transforming or redesigning HR is really done through the lens of how do we make the business better. The goal is not to optimize HR. The goal is to truly increase the amount of impact that HR has on the business. That needs to be the goal and the starting point. So when we say keep an outside-in perspective, what we're saying is that at the front end of any HR transformation, in fact, I'll even go more general, at the beginning of any improvement effort you do inside a company, you need to start with, how does the work that we're trying to improve, how does that support the business objective? You need to understand what external customers are asking for. It's helpful to understand what competitors are doing. It's helpful to understand industry dynamics. And it's helpful to understand key demographic and technical trends. Each of those categories, each of those topics becomes a critical understanding and backdrop for effective HR design and HR transformation. Another contextual framework that we use that becomes really key to how we think about the process and really drives the steps. At a high level, we'd say that there are two ways that HR creates value. One of those is by doing what we call essential work really well. Essential work is work that has to be done to keep the business running, but it is not the work that drives competitive advantage. However, and this is really a key point, if the essential work isn't done well, it actually creates competitive disadvantage. So it has to be done well. We sometimes even use the word flawless. It has to be done in a flawless way so that the costs of HR are managed appropriately, and so that the day-to-day HR work is done so smoothly that it actually frees up time and resources to do the strategic work well. The strategic work is the second type of work that we find in HR. Strategic work is work that directly supports the key capabilities of the business. It's work that directly ties to how you create competitive advantage and differentiation as a business. Part of what we try and help do when we go through the design process, what we help organizations do, is figure out what is the essential work that goes on in HR and what is the strategic work that goes on in HR. Our bias is that the essential work needs to be designed differently. It's designed using an efficiency lens and an efficiency point of view. And the strategic work needs to be designed using effectiveness logic and impact and responsiveness logic. So a key starting point for us, and we'll talk a little more about this, but it's actually recognizing that all HR work is not created equal. Both strategic work and essential work are critical. Both of them have to be done very well. And in fact, both of them require people who have seniority and expertise and are very talented to do both of them well. So it has nothing to do with how we value people or the value that we put on people. We don't say that we value you more because you do strategic work and we value you less because you do essential work. But we have to understand the nature of essential work and the nature of strategic work in order to do a really good HR design. One last general principle slide that I'll talk to. And in our experience, this is almost universally true, and that is that there are typically limits to the resources that can be spent on HR. The same could be said for finance and IT. But in general, when you think about support functions, all organizations have limited resources. There's limits to what organizations will spend on HR. If you go back to the framework I just talked about of strategic work and essential work, doing the high-impact strategic work is what creates a reputation for impact. It's what makes business leaders recognize strategic value in HR and recognize that you truly can be a business partner and help create business results. Doing essential work really efficiently is critically important, as I mentioned earlier, but it really only gets HR to neutral in the eyes of most leaders. Doing essential work really well is what people expect you to do. It's not what creates differentiation. So the challenge of an HR organization, and I would add the challenge of doing HR design, is to say, how do we do this in a way, and how do we organize the work so we increase the impact of strategic work, and we figure out how to deliver essential work as efficiently as possible. What that does is allow us to create the right resource mix of people that are actually doing strategic work versus those that are doing essential work. If we don't do strategic work well, we're destroying value. If we don't do essential work well, what we're doing is leaving money on the table. So there are 4 steps that we typically think of when we go through HR transformation. So step 1 for us is collecting the inside-out data. We do that multiple ways. In fact, this is probably the step for us that has the most variability when we do a project because it's heavily impacted by how much of that already exists. We don't have a need or a desire to recreate work that's already done. But the key is we've got to have perspective from external stakeholders. So key customers, we've even talked to investors before. Some organizations have key relationships with government regulators or even with suppliers and partners. Whoever those relevant people are, the external stakeholder group, and obviously customers are at the center of that. But the key is we need to have outside-in data. We also love to have information around key trends, as I mentioned, around demographics and technology, things that might be going on politically, in different markets, what's going on with the economy. Any kind of industry and competitor data is really helpful. What it does is informs the key decision-making process to actually tell us what work in HR is strategic. If we don't do a good job in collecting outside-in data, the decision of what HR work is strategic versus what's essential almost always becomes a political and a philosophical debate. We want to move that to a strategic debate and to a strategic conversation. Good outside-in data around what the business needs to be doing becomes a key part of that. Step 2 is related to that, and it's still work that we do in and around HR before we would actually start the HR process. And what this really does is collect feedback from the business on several things. So one is that we like to have information around, obviously, the business model and the business strategy. That becomes key. The second one is actually understanding the perception of the HR department strengths and weaknesses. Let me say a word about that because for me this is a really key point. We see a lot of HR groups begin transformation process by asking business leaders what they like about HR and what HR does well and what HR struggles with. Our perspective on that is, while that's very important data to have and you should have it, it's not sufficient. Frequently, what's true is leaders will answer the question based upon their current feeling of someone they work with in HR, and they'll also answer that question based upon their knowledge of what they think HR is capable of doing. We think both of those are insufficient to drive the HR design. So we do want to understand business model. We do want to understand what the business leaders want from us, but we have to combine that with the step one outside-in data so we get a broader context. So we're not just creating an HR organization that meets today's current needs, and we're not designing an HR organization that simply meets what existing leaders think HR is capable of doing. A last point on that is it's very easy, and we frequently see organizations that skip over or really do insufficient work on step one and step two. I'll repeat myself and say that it's doing step one and step two in a way that doing that thoroughly is what helps you really answer the key questions of what is the HR work that's strategic and what is the HR work that's really essential in nature. Step three is where we get into the detail of the process. Step three is how we organize the HR work. In most processes that we go through, the step one and step two will take several weeks to several months, depending on schedules and availability and what data that you have. Step three itself usually takes 3 to 4 months of work, depending on the size of the HR organization. And when we do this with an internal design team, so we're working with you, not coming in and just trying to hand you an off-the-shelf answer. But we go through a thorough process with design teams, and I'll cover this at a high level. And again, this is one of those areas where if you've got questions about this, we'd love to hear from you so we can follow up and provide you more information. But we literally will identify all of the HR outputs and deliverables. So not what HR does internally in HR, but what you deliver to the business and to the enterprise. We go through in detail and determine the strategic impact of each of those outputs. And we actually then figure out how do we group that work in a way so that the strategic work can have the greatest impact, and so the essential work can be done with the greatest amount of efficiency. We use this phase to actually group the work, to create structures. We identify the key processes. We identify the key roles that need to be put in place. We'll even identify key HR systems that need to be implemented, and also at this point build a transition plan. A word about this part of the process of step three that for us is a critical design principle is we design using what we call ideal future logic. Even the step one and step two work that we're doing, we're trying to understand what keeps business leaders up at night. We're trying to look through a lens to see what are the challenges that are coming in the next 1 to 3 years for the business. So the design logic is we're not designing around current people. We're not designing around current capabilities. We're not designing around the current structure. We're trying to figure out, given what we've learned about the needs of the business going forward, how do we create an HR organization that is ideally positioned to meet those challenges? It has to be doable, so it's not a theoretical design, but it needs to be done with forward-looking perspective. Once we've done that, we then build a transition plan for what are the key steps that need to take to move the organization to actually realize the design that you've put in place. In honesty, most of those transitions go fairly quickly, but we intentionally try and get people to move out of current state and current logic when they do the design. I think it's one of the great values that we add as external consultants because we're not as tied to and committed to the way the current organization works. Step 4 is obviously another space where RBL has a lot of capability and has a lot of IP, and that is really the development of HR professionals. Probably the most common question that we get at RBL is people will call us and say, how do we make our HR people more strategic, or how do we stand up HR business partners? We have a lot of content that actually helps you do that. And at the end of a design process, with the role clarity that you get, we think the impact of the HR development is actually much greater than if you do it without going through some kind of a design process. The reality is that setting up these strategic roles means there's a lot of essential work that needs to be done other places. So one of the learnings for us is it's really hard to improve an HR organization just by trying to address one role at a time, because part of what you've got to figure out is how do we position essential work and how do we position strategic work. Once that's done, this development work and the development process that we have has huge impact. And we have executive programs, we have custom in-house programs that we do. We have an RBL Institute, which is a think tank for HR professionals. We have a number of levers that we can pull on this. And it's certainly a place that we have both a lot of content and a lot of passion. So let me review just some keys to HR design. I've walked you through the 4 steps. I've shared some context, some key things we think about on the front end. This is a bit of a repeat, but I think it gives a nice summary to some keys that we've learned over the years and years of doing this in a lot of different companies, in a lot of different industries, and really in different parts of the world. So key number 1 is, and I've touched on this but haven't said this directly, essential work needs to be separated from strategic work. If you have the same people in the same roles doing essential work that are doing strategic work, what happens is the strategic work loses, the essential work wins. The essential work almost always shows up as the most day-to-day and the most urgent. So if the essential work outputs and the strategic work outputs are marbled together, it will become very difficult for the strategic work to get the attention that it needs to drive the business forward. What's also true is the essential work gets compromised as well, because people are continually being pulled both directions, even though the essential work usually wins. So that becomes a key tenet of what we do in phase 3 when we're going through design. I've talked about the next 2 keys. So we organize essential work to maximize efficiency. We organize strategic work to maximize the leverage and responsiveness to the business. Once you go through step 3, those become fairly straightforward. The 4th key, and again we've talked about this, and it's one that we can't reiterate enough. The goal is not to optimize HR, it's actually to design HR in a way that maximizes value to the business. And finally, the last one is HR efforts must align with the key capabilities of the organization. I would add to that the HR design needs to actually be complementary to the macro design of the business as well. We're trying to understand business line and business leaders. We're trying to understand what keeps business leaders up at night. We're trying to figure out how to truly be partners that help drive the business forward. I hope this has been helpful. I know we've covered a lot of things pretty quickly, and obviously there's a whole bunch more that could be said about each one of these slides. Would love your feedback on if this is helpful, and also if you've got a place, if you're starting an HR design or in the middle of a design where we could be of value, even if it's just to respond to some questions. We have a lot invested in helping HR organizations be effective, and we'd love to do all we can to help you as part of that process.